This video is sponsored by Describe. Why do we ask questions? I've been thinking about the movie Finding Forrester a lot lately, which is probably not a sentence anyone has ever said before. If you're not familiar with the film, which you probably aren't, there's a scene very early in the movie where Jamal, the talented young writer and basketball star, gets his first life lesson from the reclusive and legendary author William Forrester, played by Sean Connery. Forrester is birdwatching and he asks Jamal to stir his soup on the stove for him. As he does so, Jamal asks why his mother's soup never firms up like this. At first, Forrester doesn't answer, he's preoccupied with his birdwatching. And Jamal asks another question, an innocuous one. Does Forrester ever leave the apartment to go birdwatching? He's asking because Forrester is a recluse, very much in the vein of J.D. Salinger. He published one book and then became a shut-in. His home is like a well-organized hoarder's house. He has his groceries delivered, and it's not even 2020. So Jamal is asking if Forrester is willing to leave his home for what appears to be one of his only hobbies. And Forrester responds with a lecture, one that has stuck with me for more than 2 decades.
You should have stayed with the soup question. The object of a question is to obtain information that matters to us and to no one else. Huh? You were wondering why your soup doesn't firm up? Well, probably because your mother was brought up in a house that never thought about wasting milk in soup. Now, that question was a good one. In contrast to, do I ever go outside? Which fails to meet the basic criteria of obtaining information that matters to you.
All right, man. I guess I don't have any more soup questions.
When I say this lecture has stuck with me, I literally mean that the phrase soup question has rattled around in my head for years. I've used it to evaluate whether I'm asking salient questions. It's been a yardstick as I try to judge what people are actually asking when they ask a question that seems strange to me, possibly because there's something else they want that they haven't fully asked for yet. But recently I rewatched Finding Forrester for the first time in maybe a decade, and I realized something. Forrester is wrong about questions in this movie. Or to be more accurate, his opinion on questions reflects his character flaw, the way he has withdrawn from the world. Because let's look at his answer again. The object of a question is to obtain information that matters to us. Okay, yeah, so far so good. I would agree that a good question is about getting information. But then he adds, and no one else. What? Wait, so you can only ask a question if nobody else would also want to know the answer? Why would that be part of it? Well, consider the source. Forrester wrote a beloved novel, and then everybody hounded him by talking about what the novel meant, and which people in his life Forrester had inserted into the novel as characters. And then he retreated into his home for decades, and now that's the other question everyone wants to know about. Why did he disappear? Did he write any more novels? So that's why Forrester's philosophy about questions includes this addendum that essentially gives him an excuse to not answer personal questions that he hates answering. For someone like Forrester, there's no difference between somebody asking if he goes outside to do birdwatching versus someone asking why he never wrote again or doesn't leave his home. Because of course if he answers the former and says whether or not he is willing to leave his house for birdwatching, it's not out of the question that that conversation could lead to why he never leaves the house at all, and that leads to why did he shut himself off from the world, and that leads to whether or not he ever wrote another novel, and that leads to his feelings about the reaction of the public to his first novel, and that leads back to the true meaning of his novel, and once again he doesn't want to talk about that. So it's easier for him to simply close himself off from any personal questions that he doesn't feel serve his criteria for what makes a good question. And ironically, he thinks a question is good if the question is selfish. After all, if somebody is clear with what they want from you, then it's easier to deal with that than to deal with all the doting fans who love his work and just wanted to share their appreciation until they finally get around to asking about the hidden meaning of his novel and wondering why he didn't write another. This rule keeps him in control. Now, the next time his soup question philosophy is brought up in the film comes a little bit later on when Jamal asks if Forrester ever got married, and Forrester responds.
Not exactly a soup question, is it?
But then, he answers the question.
No. No, I never did.
Then he pivots to giving Jamal relationship advice, which I guess retroactively does make this a soup question. But also, this is a big step for Forrester. Earlier in the movie, he wasn't even willing to talk about whether or not he leaves the apartment. It would have been impossible to imagine him answering a question about his love life. But the point is, on revisiting this film as an adult, I realized that I've been spending a good deal of my adult life thinking about questions all wrong. This philosophy, the soup question mentality, boils down the value of all questions to how transactional they are. And it comes down on the side of being pro-transactional. In Forrester's mind, the more a question serves you, the better the question is. But Forrester's arc in the movie is about opening up more, something I'd essentially forgotten in the 2 decades since I first saw the film. Nowadays, with a new perspective, I wonder how this philosophy played a role in my life up until this point. I wonder if it served me well as a Hollywood assistant, where every interaction really is transactional. Assistants constantly get together for drinks, not just to blow off steam, but also because it makes it easier to ask each other for favors. And that's all Hollywood is, it's just an industry of people asking each other for favors. But I wonder if there were other aspects of my life where I carry this philosophy with me and it didn't serve me so well. Because I actually think this ideology, that your questions have to serve some agenda, can actually be really toxic. And in fact, this is the risk with any hard rule. This channel is all about giving you advice. Usually I focus on advice for your D&D game, but sometimes we branch out to other endeavors of creative writing or self-confidence, that kind of thing. But as you can see from the soup question example, there's a danger with any piece of advice that begins with always or never. Yes, there is a good reason to think about why you're asking a question. It obviously helps you cut down on annoying chit-chat, which is what Forrester really wanted from that scene. But it also helps you be more precise with what you're asking. If you know why you're asking a question, it can help you phrase it better. But it also shuts off an entire avenue of human interaction. When Jamal asks about whether Forrester goes outside, or whether he got married, or why he doesn't buy his own groceries, or why Forrester wears his socks inside out, he's asking because he wants to know more about Forrester. He's interested in getting to know him. And over the years, I'd completely forgotten that Forrester's cardinal rule about questions is a character flaw. This is the danger of having an always rule, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as asking questions of another human being. And I tell you all of that so you'll know that when I say this next thing, I don't say it lightly. Because I do have a rule about questions, and it has the word always in it. And despite the story I just shared with you about the risks of this kind of approach, I actually think this is a pretty important rule. I strongly believe that when you're asking a question, you should always be prepared to get any answer. Or, to be more precise, you should be prepared to get an answer you don't like. My shorthand version of the rule is be prepared to receive any answer. That is how I always say it, but let's be honest. That's not always possible. Sometimes someone answers something in a way that is wildly different from what you were expecting. You can't be prepared for that.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how often do you go to the bathroom?
The pyramids of ancient Egypt.
Now, I actually do believe that this rule originated from really thinking about the purpose of why we ask questions, which means in a roundabout way it was probably inspired by this scene from Finding Forrester. But while that scene is about Forrester being closed off from other people and wanting to avoid answering any difficult questions about his past, my rule kind of does the opposite. The goal is to make sure you are approaching any question with an open mind. Let's go back to that question I asked at the beginning of the video. Why do we ask questions? Well, obviously it's because we want to find something out. We want to get an answer. And yeah, duh. But the reason I think it's important to be prepared to get any answer is to make sure you are drawing a distinction between asking a question to get an answer and asking a question to get a specific answer. Because I find that very often in life when we ask a question, we aren't really ready for what happens if someone gives us the answer we don't want to hear. For example, has your partner ever said, "Would you mind emptying the dishwasher?" Has your boss ever said, "Could you get this person on the phone?" Those are not really questions. They're polite ways to make requests. Now, my goal today is not to deconstruct society and claim that this sort of behavior isn't appropriate. No, this is fine. It's how people talk. I certainly wouldn't like it if my wife just said, "Mike, empty the dishwasher," without at least trying to make it sound like I had some say in the matter. I think most of us would feel the same way. So I'm not going to claim that because these sorts of questions break my rule that they're somehow inappropriate or anything like that. That's not my point. But I think there's a difference between the mundane, not question questions that we're all pretty used to, and when you ask a real question, but you still have a right answer that you're hoping to hear. Again, my goal isn't to audit your relationships or anything like that, but this is something that I personally have worked on in my own relationships, in my romantic relationship, and my family dynamics, and my friendships. As an example, let's say you're in an argument with somebody, or even just a heated discussion with someone. Maybe it's a coworker, or a roommate, or a significant other, whatever it is. And they make some sort of snide comment about you. Maybe something like, "I wouldn't be surprised if you just took the credit when you talked to the boss and cut me out of this project entirely." And you might respond by asking if that's something they really think you would do. But there's a way to ask that question where you're essentially being sarcastic or trying to win the argument. And there's a way to ask where you're actually asking because you want to know their answer. Now, I've often been the person who does the former, who responds by saying, "Do I really seem like someone who would do that?" The subtext is, I know I wouldn't do that, and you know I wouldn't do that, and so trying to claim that I would makes you either stupid or a liar or maybe both, and you're a bad person. So that's not really a question, it's a rhetorical device. However, if you try to keep my rule in mind, you'll find that if you ask the same question, it can have a totally different connotation. Wait, do I seem like someone who would do that? Now with this version, I'm still getting my point across. I don't think that's something I would do. But now instead of being a smartass, which is my default setting, I'm asking this question because I want to improve myself. I want to figure out if this is how I'm presenting myself so I can work on this in the future. And so I genuinely want to know the answer, so I can better myself. And also, in this example, a question like that can help de-escalate a situation. The first version is fun and sassy, and it's also going to keep the tension going in your interaction. It might even make it worse. But with the second example, I'm trying to humble myself enough to acknowledge that there's something I don't know, whether or not I'm coming across a certain way that I'm not expecting. And I'm implying that if that's the case, then there's something I need to work on. And that can help take down the temperature of a heated interaction because I'm asking a genuine question and I really do want to get a real answer. Now, this rule does not mean you have to feel happy with any answer you get. If you ask people tough questions, you might get tough answers that don't feel good to hear. But instead, this mindset is about accepting that you can't control how people might reply and being okay with that. It's about understanding that if you really want to ask a question, you need to let go of the idea that you know how they should answer. If you already have an answer in mind, then it's not really a question. It's just a statement of what you hope will happen, what you hope they're going to say, just communicated in a confusing way. And that's what we're trying to avoid by remembering that when we ask a question, our goal is to get their answer, not our preferred answer. And this is why I'm talking about this on my D&D channel. Because if we can remember this rule, we have a better chance of combating our own railroading, especially accidental railroading. When we run D&D games, half of what we do is just asking our players questions. Almost everything in D&D boils down to the GM presenting a scenario for the players and asking what the players want to do, and then they respond with the action they want to take, and the GM narrates the consequences and moves on to the next choice the players need to make, and so on. And because D&D is so heavily inspired by fantasy fiction and folklore, we tend to come into a D&D game expecting a story to play out, and for that story to follow the rules of fiction that we're used to. And that's definitely something we're going to talk about a lot more in the future, maybe in a series of videos coming next year, stay tuned. But one side effect of this mentality is that it's very easy for game masters to have a very clear idea in their head of what the players should do, or what they want the players to do, or what would make the most sense for the players to do if the GM was in their shoes, or what would be the most dramatic or exciting thing for the players to do, even if that's not the most convenient thing for the GM. And I'm giving lots of different examples there because this can come in lots of different perspectives. The last example is probably the closest to what I tend to experience as a game master. The players find themselves in some sort of scenario, and I'll start getting excited because, oh, I think I know what's coming next, and I think it's going to be really exciting or dramatic, even if it's not what I had planned, even if it means I'm going to have to throw out my entire session that I'd prepped and make some stuff up on the fly. I still hear the players say something, and I get an idea in my head of what the players are going to do, or maybe what I think they should do, or what I would do if I was in their position. And I get excited, and then, if they don't do that thing, I find myself getting disappointed, even though I'm fully aware that this is their game, and they should be in control of what they do. And 99% of the time when I'm running a game, I have no problem setting my ego aside or my expectations aside and following the players' leads. But every once in a while, when I ask the players a question, there is something I'm expecting them to say, or something I'm hoping they'll say. This is why I mentioned accidental railroading. I try to be really good about not making plans for my game too dependent on what the players are going to do. I try to be really good about making sure my players have choices in front of them rather than setting up scenarios so they can only do what I have prepared. And that's the type of railroading we talk about the most often when we use that term in this hobby. We're talking about scenarios where the GM gives the players no choices and refuses to allow them to use their cool and exciting ideas to solve the problem in ways the GM was not expecting. However, every once in a while you might do a little bit of accidental railroading. Something might happen in the middle of a session and you have some idea about where things are going, you have some expectations about what the players are going to do next, and then you try to facilitate that, or prepare your game so that this idea will go down the proper way. And then when you get to that key moment and you ask the players what they're going to do so they can do the thing, they don't do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's a bad guy in this scenario. It's not your fault that you didn't properly predict what the players were going to do, and it's not the players' faults that they didn't do what you were expecting. However, whenever I find myself in a situation like that, I remember my rule. I asked my players a question. What are you going to do? If I wasn't okay with them answering the way they wanted, then I shouldn't have asked the question. Usually, this can help me keep my priorities in line and make sure my game is not focused on the story I planned or the expectations I had. Instead, keeping this philosophy in mind helps me focus on facilitating the story that my players are telling about their characters. And when you start using this rule as your guiding star as you run your games, you'll begin to notice that it improves the experience in any number of ways. For example, I would argue that when you ask your players to make a roll or you roll something behind the screen, you're asking the dice to contribute to the storytelling of the session. So with this philosophy in mind, you should be prepared for whatever answer the dice might give you. If you weren't going to honor the dice results, you shouldn't have rolled. If you put your players in a dialogue scene with an important NPC, but you're not okay with them saying something that you don't expect and potentially steering the scene in a direction you weren't anticipating, then don't make it a dialogue scene. Handle it through a cutscene or send them a letter or something. Don't let it be a scene if the players can't change the trajectory of the scene. If you put two potential adventures in front of the players, but you've only prepped one of them, then you need to be ready for the possibility that the players will choose the adventure you haven't had a chance to prep. Otherwise, don't put them both in front of the players. Hell, I'm probably the most guilty of this during character creation. A player will say something about a character they're considering rolling up, and I'll get so excited for that idea. Maybe that character could lead to some cool plot lines, or I think that subclass is really fun, or it'll pair really well with another character someone else in the group is planning to roll up. For whatever reason, I want to encourage them. Yes, play that character. And I have to bite my tongue, because it's not my character. And even though I can tell them that if they do commit to a character they're considering, it'll be cool or dramatic or whatever, it's not my job to decide what character they're going to play. And there's no point in putting my thumb on the scale in the hopes that they'll have a great experience at some point down the road, if it leads to them choosing a character that they weren't ultimately going to choose without my intervention, and won't be as excited about playing in the campaign. As game masters, we're responsible for a lot of aspects about a game session. But I think some GMs forget that our obligation isn't to our stories or our plans, it's to our players and their characters. And keeping this philosophy in mind when I interact with my players is just one tool I use to help keep the players as my primary focus. If I can strip away any expectations for how they might respond, how they should respond, how I hope they'll respond, then I'll be more prepared to work with whatever answer they give me. And that just leads to a better time for everyone at the table. Of course, deviating from your plans and letting go of your expectations in the middle of a game can be stressful. Yes, obviously we want to make sure that our players' goals are the priority, but it can be hard to pivot on a dime and change our game so that we can actually accommodate our players' unexpected desires. Unless, of course, you use today's sponsor, Describe. Describe is a terrific website that offers pre-written scenes that you can read aloud at your game table. They've got descriptions of locations, monsters, magic items, NPCs, planes of existence, anything you can think of. And especially the stuff that you specifically did not think of before the game because you thought the players were going to do something else and now you have to pivot at the last minute. Of course, it's not going to do any good if your players are going to get into combat in a brand new location. Then you're kind of screwed. Except actually, that's not true. It will help, because Describe has an incredible selection of maps that you can drop directly into your games. Possibly literally, because these maps are compatible with Foundry VTT. And if you need descriptions for these maps, you're in luck, because each major region or landmark on the map includes one of their immersive descriptions, so you can describe the location of your players and maybe even get inspired for an encounter or two. And Describe is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit describe.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK, you'll save 10% off of your first subscription payment. Once again, that's dscryb.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thanks so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. This was a fun week. I put out a video every day this week, and I'm really happy with how they came together, so I really appreciate the support. And if you want to see more from me, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. That's honestly the best way to help support the channel. There are a few other ways you can also show support if you're interested. If you want to help support the channel financially, you can become a patron or a YouTube member or make a one-time contribution through Ko-fi. If you want to help grow this community and join a group of terrific people, check out my Discord server. And if you want to keep up to date with all my updates, join my newsletter. These days, social media is such a nightmare that my newsletter is honestly going to be the best way for you to stay up to date with what I've got going on. All those links are in the doobly-doo below, along with a link to check your voter registration. Make sure to vote this year, it's very important. In case you missed it, I just did a video about the future of D&D 2024. You can check that video out right here. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.